Welcome to RegTalks, the podcast dedicated to the latest trends from the world of RegTech, FinTech, and financial regulations. My name is Claus Christensen, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of award-winning RegTech provider Know Your Customer. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Bion Behdin, CRO and co-founder of AML compliance startup First AML, as my guest. Bion is the co-founder and Chief Revenue Officer of First AML. Having spent 7 years working in corporate commercial banking across 3 major banks, he experienced the impact of inefficient and unfriendly AML processes firsthand. It was this experience that spurred him and his fellow co-founders to start First AML. Bion brings to clients a wealth of experience when it comes to AML regulations and streamlining compliance. Thanks, Bion, for joining us for this episode of RegTalks.
Thanks for having me, Klaus. I'm excited to get going.
Great. Could we start with, could you share, I said already, the journey into RegTech space started with your experience at ANZ and other banks, how this shaped your approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. When I was in finance, we would do these big, flashy pitches in corporate and commercial banking, and we would win the client, and then I would proceed to put them through probably the worst onboarding experience of their life, trying to get an account opened with a tier 1 bank. Now, the part that I personally struggled with as a frontline officer working in the bank, especially when it comes to AML, the relationship between the customer, the frontline teams, and the compliance division. I was sort of the conduit between compliance and the customer, not really knowing what to collect, what to verify, and that sort of thing. So First AML has really been born out of that frustration between compliance divisions, the fee earning teams that need to close revenue, and the end client at the end of all this who has to provide a certain amount of information, often personal information that they generally don't feel too happy to provide. So that's the problem that First AML solves. It's the workflow between those 3 parties.
I have to say, I do and I don't envy you for that experience. It was one that we actually lacked in the beginning when we created KYC, my co-founders and I, because we had a legal co-founder and me as a technical co-founder. Seems ideal, but what we were missing was that banking experience. Listening to it, it wasn't all that pleasant. And I know it isn't from the customer side. And that is what both our companies are trying to solve, obviously. So what led you to join First AML, and how has your role evolved since then? Because my role certainly did evolve.
Yeah, it's an interesting one when you look at sort of my role as a founder and sort of chief revenue officer. I think the average tenure for a chief revenue officer in a technology company is about 18 months. So it's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. But when we sort of started the company, I started it with 2 other guys. One of them was with me from finance. The other one was an ex-management consultant. So we kind of naturally fell into our roles. Originally, we weren't technical co-founders. We actually started the business as a sort of lo-fi, no technology business. And we actually got to about $1 million ARR without building any technology. And then we sort of started to invest really heavily in the proliferation of that technology. My role has always sort of been the revenue side, the customer side, understanding customer problems. But I often feel that people in sales leadership roles don't talk enough about the product. I feel like I'm more a product person than a revenue person, because without a good product, honestly, you can cold call as many customers as you want, but to get that serious traction, it has to be product first.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That mirrors our own philosophy at KYC. We wanted to build the perfect product for this space, KYB, or business entity verification in our case, and go deep on that. And sometimes I do think we should have invested more on the revenue and the marketing side early on. We did that in the later years, obviously, but at the very beginning, we didn't even have funds, and we just concentrated on building the best product we could. I think it's great from an integrity viewpoint, but it can be challenging from a revenue viewpoint if you don't have that in the beginning. And my role, as I said, certainly changed. I always say I haven't led a company over 9 years. I've led 9 different companies over each 1 year, because it changed so much at the time.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting intersect between sales and products because a lot of the core features that we have now, the really sort of loved features, we didn't have until we had customer feedback on the product. And that includes obviously you guys are a partner of First AML, but it's kind of that iteration you're building a plane while you're flying it, I guess, which is really hard, and especially when you're working with regulation technology, there is a certain level of you need to have the core functionality working really, really well before you can really start to innovate. And I think that's where a lot of people miss the trick a little bit.
That's true. Yeah. If like a new startup founder would have asked me for advice now about starting something in RegTech, I would say, well, if it's your first rodeo, I wouldn't go here because it is very hard to sell into these very large institutions, which we target, banks and so on. And second, if you want to target them, don't go into the compliance side. That's like the most sensitive thing and the most difficult to get into. So just a little warning there. But obviously, we both managed over time. When we looked at First AML and where we discussed it first, I noticed that you are quite active in the legal space, that you have law firms. And that I found interesting because we struggled with that in the beginning. We do have a few now, but that doesn't seem to be an easy fit for what specifically we built. You mentioned there were challenges in technology adoption generally, given that smaller firms often rely on multiple tools, for example. How crucial is that element of orchestration in their operations? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think especially in the AML space, it's so fragmented. Like there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And First AML focuses on the orchestration layer, which is the actual operational side of doing customer due diligence. Legal's our biggest sector now. Legal and finance are sort of our two core sectors. And I think the reason that people have responded quite well to the First AML product, especially in the legal sector, is that sort of that relationship I was talking about earlier. It's that end customer, and then you've got your fee earners, which are your frontline lawyers. And then often in these larger firms, you'll have a separate compliance department, which is either advising or assisting those fee earners. So the use case of our product fits quite well into their workflow, and that's why it's been widely adopted. But I think you're totally right about these point solutions and things like that. Like when we go into a firm, it's often a harder sell because we're not only replacing 3 products that they're currently using, we're also replacing their workflow. So they have to design the new workflow around the First ML product. It's a lot easier to sell faster or cheaper biometric tool and just rip out certified copies, for example, as part of an overall process. But in my opinion, like if you want to get the efficiency gains, that orchestration is so important in especially medium-sized firms because otherwise it's just a band-aid to a broken leg, really. You can do EIV faster, that's great, but there's so much other aspects to it that people really struggle with.
I disagree a little bit with the evaluation that it's easier to sell a point solution because we've been concentrating on one specific problem very hard in our company. We took the
Yes.
opposite approach. And
KYB.
in our, yeah, exactly, KYB, business verification. And we went deep on that, like really deep, and did it to the 9th degree, thinking that is actually a core problem that needs to be solved. And that is true. But without the larger orchestration, it's actually not that simple to sell. So it's both sides are hard. Just the orchestration is hard. Just the going deep on one vertical is hard. I think that is probably just the beauty of this cooperation, that it fits in together and both approaches together have a lot more power.
Yeah, I think especially around the mid-market, like the mid-market's a knife fight. Like it's literally, there's a lot of providers doing a lot of different things. It's a AML, especially, I mean, we started the company, 7, 8 years ago now. In the last 2 or 3 years, just the amount of new providers that have sort of appeared in market doing very similar things to each other it's pretty crazy, to be honest, like the amount of new entrants into the space. I mean, competition's good, but I do fear that it does confuse a lot of the buyers. And I think that's something that RegTech firms really need to work on. It's their clear messaging, what problem are you solving, and that sort of thing. And I think, yeah, buyers are getting very confused, especially in the mid-market at the moment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that is in part intentional by new players. They bring up these superlatives I love to pick fights on LinkedIn about people who say they have 238 countries covered when there are only 196 official ones out there. Uh, that sort of thing is in the market. And yeah, a bit of education and real honesty and clear messaging is really important. And it's part of what we do of this podcast as well. We can talk about these things and point them out and help buyers and users in the space discover the real value in all these products. Yeah. When we chatted last, I remember you mentioned the one-to-many approach in RegTech. What did you mean there?
If you think about the space, there's sort of different layers. If you think about it like a layer cake, basically, and at the bottom you've got your sort of data layer, and then on top of that you've got your sort of innovation layer, but narrow product layer, and that sort of feeds data into innovation. And then you've got sort of orchestration, which First AML plays in. And the one-to-many approach in RegTech is super interesting via things like partnerships. So we have a lot of partnerships. Obviously, I know your customers are a big partner of First AML now, but other data partners that allow basically access to our client base without them having to do direct selling into them. I think that's a really, really interesting way to sort of sell the product. I think it's a really growing sector, but there's got to be some platforms that end up as sort of leaders in the space. And I don't particularly think there is anyone yet that is sort of a leader in the platform RegTech space. Yes, you've got like your large players like your Finego and things like that, but in that middle space, there's a lot of sort of open air at the moment. And I think, yeah, depending on where you want to sit in the stack, you should have different strategies for how you get clients, really.
Mm. You and I both are obviously very closely watching the space, the investments made, the maybe acquisitions made. Where do you think is this going? You say in the mid-market, there's no clear winners there. So that's a great place to be at the moment. Do you think consolidation is near term, or is it a little further away, or what will happen?
Honestly, I think it's in the next 12 months. Like it's coming like really soon. I don't know about you, but you've probably received 3 or 4 IMs across your desk in the last 2 weeks, I've received about 3 or 4 IMs, all very similar story, growing, but not growing very fast, all between sort of, I guess, 5 million euros to 10, 12 million euro space, very similar company profiles. And I think consolidation in our sector is inevitable. I think there's a lot of sort of really good medium-sized players, but they're struggling to get scale. So consolidation is going to happen. Whether it's vertical or horizontal is still yet to be determined on that.
True.
I fear that a lot of the technology in the space isn't actually that good. And I think that's the key concern that I would have anyone who's looking to buy. It's really understand the technology stack. Like, why haven't they been able to scale past their current size and things like that? And yeah, is there enough buyers for that? Or there's a lot of, for example, electronic verification providers that are subscale at the moment, and whether that's because they're being outcompeted by some of the bigger players or not, it's kind of hard to understand. So that sector specifically within RegTech, identity is a really strange one. I'd probably stay away from anything like that because I'm not sure the quality of the technology sitting in behind it.
Yeah. I remember there was like 2022, there was a big wave of investments, 200 million, 400 million into Jumio, Trulio, those IDV providers. And I was thinking at the time, like, guys, are you sure you know what you're doing? There is not enough money on any one of them to make them a winner, like that vision fund strategy, just like invest so much that one is a winner. We'll see about that. But I think I agree, consolidation will happen. And I personally also got a lot of contacts in the last, let's say half year, outreach out from investors, which was strange because there was no real hook that started it, but it was unusual. So there's people watching this space very closely and wanting to talk. Where is it going? I think we can influence it a little bit. And this chat here is part of a strategy because as the players in the middle, in this kind of interesting but also vulnerable space, we can build networks and we are not alone there. But if we partner up, we can build something that is together, a network that is together worth a lot more than the sum of its parts and much more interesting for a larger acquisitor, for example, as well. So interesting strategy, interesting
Yeah,
game to play.
yeah, and I feel that definitely. Like when I look at like our data suppliers, right? I think about them as acquisition targets more than I'm not saying, Claus, that we're going to come to you with an offer anytime soon, but it sort of makes sense, right? Like, because if you think about that, if you're the platform and there's margin sitting with your suppliers, your data suppliers,
Yeah,
there's ability to then, through acquisition, reduce your direct cost, increase margin, but also gives you a new set of customers to sell the platform product into. So if you're building platform in the space and you have downstream suppliers, acquisition through that allows you to boost margin, but also has have their client base that may want a sort of a wider solution that you can then sell into. So that's how I think about it in the context of First AML. It's like, who's providing us the information? What does their client base look like? And do their clients need orchestration?
yep,
Because it's a lot easier to upsell an existing client and a lot cheaper to upsell an existing client than to acquire a new one.
absolutely. And Bion, not that I'm making an offer here, but for us, the same thing is true. We
Mm.
would think about, well, look, there's an orchestration provider. Well, wonder what customers could they bring us if we acquired them and integrated them.
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
It's
Spot on.
exactly
Yeah.
the same idea because that works both ways. Really
Yeah.
interesting conversation and ideas here.
Yeah, for sure. If you're like, especially if you're an identity provider, you could be looking at a KYB platform. If you're
Mm.
like, there's so many options here. It's just who wants to start doing it, I guess, is everyone's sort of waiting for the first domino to fall. I think here in the UK, one of the large, I guess you'd call them platforms of verification providers was purchased last year by private equity. So I think there'd be one that's looking to do more in the space. So yeah, I think it's going to come sooner rather than later for sure.
Yeah. And I also believe it's coming sooner because these guys need to accelerate and they can't do that by developing anything themselves. They do need to acquire, and only then it can work and they build something critical mass together. Yeah.
Yeah, especially with some of the older suppliers that have a lot of customers, but their tech isn't modern enough. Like, I feel
Mm.
like they're a prime one to acquire these sub 10 million turnover companies
Mm.
and just inject their tech into basically saving themselves, really, and then upselling their existing clients. So I think there's a lot of older providers that should be looking at the newer providers as acquisition targets.
Mm. Did we have significant exits in the space? Is there capital with those founders that could get back into RegTech at the moment?
I think obviously the biggest one that I can think of is Onfido. I think Onfido sort of had a decent exit recently, last year, that sort of thing. I know the Comply Advantage guy has been sort of seed investing quite a bit in the space. I'm not sure what his obviously position is. I don't think he's sold out 100% or anything like that. But I think there is sort of recycled capital in the space. But I mean, as you'll know, it's very hard to pick a winner right now. So it's very hard for people to go, this is the one I want to invest in, that sort of thing.
Well, in any case, both of us concentrate on executions for now. We're not actually acquiring each other right now, and we're not up for grabs immediately. So let's continue with a question that is slightly more like at the core of the topic here. I remember in an article recently about Canada's money laundering problem via predominantly their housing market. I used this term that I picked up from some other podcast called snow washing. And I think
Mhm.
you mentioned the term beach washing for Australia. How does the concept of snow washing compare to beach washing, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting one for those sort of markets. They're prime markets for money laundering through property because the property prices are generally stable, actually increasing over the last, if you look over the last 15, 20 years, Australia and Canada have had sharp increases in housing prices, relatively stable economies, no chance of less chance of currency shock. So they're prime sort of money laundering havens. And on top of that, Canada has strong AML laws, but they were shot down. The attorneys don't have to do KYC, that was shot down, which is a really common thread for where you see a lot of money laundering, where lawyers don't have to participate in the regime. It's a really big problem.
Self-regulated space.
Self-regulated, absolute horse baloney, in my opinion. But yeah, no, Australia is very much in that bucket. They don't have gatekeeper professions regulated, which is a big problem. There's a bill in Parliament at the moment looking to close that loophole for Australia, which will hopefully then start seeing it as a less attractive place to launder money. But right now, it's probably one of the easiest places in the world to launder. And same with Canada, if you don't have to go direct to a bank and you can move money through your solicitor's trust account with no KYC, it's a very attractive place to do that. So yeah, housing in Australia and Canada are classic locations to put cash.
Yeah, very, very similar. All right. I think we're at the end of our session here. We don't want to stretch the whole thing too long. So I still have one question that I ask all my listeners, all my guests. So my last question is, if you were to switch roles and become the global regulator tomorrow morning, what would you do and why?
That's a really interesting question. I think a beneficial ownership, on every country that wants to be a part of the FATF regime, essentially. If you're regulated by FATF, there is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have a publicly accessible corporate register. And I know for your business, that'd be great as well, Klaus, but it's kind of ridiculous that some countries don't have publicly available registers to be able to check UBO information. It's just more work for everyone involved. Like the clients have to provide you that data anyway, manually, that sort of thing. So if I was the global regulator of this, that's the first thing I would do. And that takes away so much like pain very, very quickly across the board and makes your product even more exciting.
It would actually work everywhere immediately, even those jurisdictions where we struggle to continue upwards because there's no shareholder information and no beneficial owner information available. But I would love to hear from our American listeners about this, or from a Japanese listener, if we have one, or Korean, because both societies have decided otherwise. I don't think it's so much a political decision. It's societies that value privacy of company ownership higher than transparency. And in Europe, UK, even in all over Asia, societies decided differently. Yes, we want transparency. We want this clean money overall. Yeah.
It's always a tension between personal rights and what's good for society, right? And I think some countries' philosophy on that is different, but I'm sort of in that there is responsibility on the individual to give up a little bit of personal freedom if it's for the betterment of humanity. But
in any case, I made you Bion the head of global AML regulations, so it's your prerogative. Go ahead.
I'd probably get sued by the DOJ for that or something like that. But anyway, that's what I would do if I could.
In any case, Bion, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on RegTalks. I totally enjoyed this and learned something. And it's great to have this conversation and this partnership going.
Yeah, sounds good, Claus. And let's keep in touch.
We will. All right. Thanks, Bion.